The Beatles.
They were okay. I mean, I was never as big a Beatle fan.
What bands did Frank Zappa hate very much? A son of the most vocal and strange people in rock history that Zappa never held back when it came to criticizing artists he thought were dull and copycat or just plain silly. If he was making fun of their singing ease, of their marketing tricks, or their lack of being unique, Zappa had a sharp tongue and strong dislike for some bands that he thought showed the worst parts of the music business. On your record that you can send off for the scores. I'm aware that some people are like that, but I don't know for sure. I know that many of them exist, but I'm not on this list long enough, so we'll check out the top 5 bands Frank Y. Zappa had such a strong dislike for. Strong thoughts about they. Even though the Fab Four were loved by both reviewers and fans alike, both calling them the best rock band of all time, viewed there as the best band of all time, Zappa impact in very different ways, he admitted. Their ability to write songs and their input to the music business, but they thought their status was very overblown. He saw a big difference between the greatness of their music and his own, one that went beyond just their art and into the area of how they, what the public thought of Zappa's. It wasn't that people didn't like the Beatles. Certainly not their music, but rather that he found strange things going on around them. Their huge success with the mass, the panic they caused, and the marketing machine that made the most of their image to be too much. Even I just thought they were ugly. He once said something silly like, "What was so they were gross the way they were? Everyone else was eaten and sold. I believed the Beatles were God. That wasn't right. They were just a good business group." I liked his comparison of the Beatles to monkeys is crazy. It was especially striking when the monkeys, while the Beatles were looked up to as artistic leaders who changed the world, the monkeys were often played in current music, ignored as a fake band, were made about a TV show. But Zappa saw something pleasant about how direct they are. They were honest about the commercialism, at least. About how they work as a pop product. He seemed to value that honesty more than the loyalty that was almost religious that went around the Beatles and found being too much, and Zappa's complaints went beyond being misplaced. Not just the Beatles, but the whole 1970s and 1980s hippie movement. In the 1960s, many people thought of hippies movement as a rising up against. Zappa thought it had broken social rules. He agreed that it had become a shallow practice. Some people in the movement were truly serious in their beliefs, try to make things better, but he saw the most people as just fans caught up in something short-lived. That the marketing of tie-dye was a big part of hippie society. Shirts with peace signs and business rock concerts that were paid for made it clear to Zappa that the movement had lost its edge. He thought it had turned into yet another form of shopping, like the Beatles craze he hated so much. Zappa didn't trust popular music at all. Culture in general. He thought that for music to do well in America, it had to go along with a whole style package, a dance craze speech in which he bemoaned this fact, saying, "No music has worked in America unless it was seen with something to dress up in and dance to, or a haircut that's not going away to happen unless you get dressed for it." This phrase summed up his dislike for the Beatles' wide effect on it was as much about him as it was about that matched their mop-top styles clothes, because it was about their music. Even though Zappa had strong criticisms, admit that he liked some Beatles songs that he didn't think they were bad outright, but he wouldn't put them on the platform where most of the world they seemed to keep his own sounds. Idea was much more cutting edge. It is creative and has a strong satirical base, making it almost impossible for him to connect with the Beatles' slick pop rock. Get close to Zappa's dislike of mass-market attractiveness was one of his main traits. In his work, he pushed the limits of rock music, adding jazz, classical, and adding avant-garde elements to his songs. He used comedy to make fun of both people and the music business itself. Even though the Beatles had their own occasionally attempting new things, never really loved him the way he did. The music was often meant to be difficult, proving that something can be sold in order to artistry. Being honest, there was the Velvet Underground. Many people think it's one of the most important bands in rock history. Was known for being creative and avant-garde approach to music, despite the fact that they praise from critics. Not everyone in it was a big deal in the 1960s music scene. What Frank Zappa said about the connection between the Velvet Underground and Zappa had a rough time. With deep-seated dislike for each other, differences in style and ideology, their short meeting in the middle of the 1960s saw one of the most known fights in the history of rock. Frank Zappa is the man in charge of the Mothers of Invention, was an innovative artist who became for his difficult humorous works, words and musical skill. The Velvet Underground, on the other hand, a simple method to music, is using echoing sounds in poetry, songs and ideas about sex and city life, while Zappa's music was about drugs, often mental and carefully put together. It was the Velvet Underground imperfections and feelings of authenticity of their different artistic styles, philosophies make it possible for and clash was bound to happen. The stress reached a head when the Velvet Underground and the A-Bill was shared by Mothers of Invention. The middle, supposedly in the 1960s, before the Velvet Underground took the stage, said something negative about them, being quoted as saying, "These guys really, it stinks that this." Comment was made in the fairest or most sincere ridicule, further made things worse between the two camps, but not all of them remember when this insult happens. Moms of later on Invention drummer Jimmy Carl Black said he didn't remember Zappa in public but not being nice to the Velvet Underground. He did say for sure that Zappa had a strong dislike for them. One possible the reason for this anger was the open connection of Velvet Underground to drug use, which Zappa did despite his countercultural image. Publicly disagreed with the Velvet wasn't the only one who was hostile. Underground's lead singer Lou Reed answered with the usual sharpness, calling Frank Zappa the most I've never heard an artist with so few skills. Later said even more, he can't because he's a loser. These sharp words said it all. The big difference between the two, Zappa was an artist who was proud of skill with technology and music sophistication, and Reed, who liked things that were songwriting and a lot of drive over specifics. Velvet Underground, the bassist Sterling Morrison also spoke out. In giving his own harsh criticism of Zappa's thought, Morrison said about commercialism, "If you said a swear word to Frank Zappa and he told the people he would do it if it made records, I'd do it if I wanted to." Comment made it sound like Zappa, despite his avant-garde tendencies, were still a worry with a chance of making money, while the Velvet Underground thought of themselves as purely artistic and not driven by this. Fight between Zappa and the Velvet Underground shows off the deep disagreements in the 1960s rock scenery, while both acts pushed that's when they broke the rules of rock music. In very different ways. Zappa's technically, the music was mocking, complicated and hard to understand, while the Velvet Underground style was deeply emotional, rich, and focused on what basement life is really like. Culture where their dislike for each other came from in these differences in art as well as personal grudges and maybe a touch of a fierce ego. Even though they were rivals, the Velvet Underground and Frank Zappa left behind lasting tributes that changed the world of music. The Velvet the Underground sound can be heard in indie rock, punk, and alternative rock, inspiring a whole group of musicians who put artistic freedom ahead of specifics, expert skill, while Zappa's work still held in high regard for its diversity, new ideas, and not being afraid review of society and their fight. While in the end, fun highlights the wealth and variety of rock from the 1960s music, where even people who didn't like each other people were making the future of in their own ways. Zeppelin and Led Zeppelin and Frank Zappa stand for two very different ways of looking at rock music and the society that went along with it. Even though both had a big impact in creating the world's rock and roll, their ideas, artistic styles, and people in public were almost completely different. Zappa, the avant-garde sadists, were thrilled by tearing down rock star luxury, while Led Zeppelin was the perfect example of the show that made rock stars famous in the 1970s. It may have been natural that Zappa would do this. Wouldn't agree with Led Zeppelin, especially with lead singer Robert Plant. There was more to Frank Zappa than just music. An activist, a musician, and a cultural and angry reviewer who couldn't stand the grandeur of popular rock. His music, that is often satirical, included making fun of the industry's big bands, and Led Zeppelin was one of the most popular rock bands in the world of all time was a main goal, while a lot of artists at the time looked up to Led Zeppelin for their amazing skill and a groundbreaking mix of he heard blues, hard rock, and spirituality. He saw them through a different lens. Not as pleased with their big sound and famous stage presence, among other things want to draw attention to their too much of both music and personal. One of the most well-known, there were times when Zappa made fun of Led Zeppelin came from the things he said about the so-called Mud Shark episode depravity that was allegedly committed by people in the band and a groupie at the Edgewater Inn in Seattle in 1969. This story got a lot of attention in rock. Myths were often used to make fun of people. During Zappa's live shows with the Mothers of Invention, he often brought the event up during his new live music in New York City, and it was to life on the 1971 live album June at Fillmore East in 1971. This wasn't just about it was a way to tell a sexy story of drawing attention to the folly and the disgusting side of rock star excess. Zappa was different from many of his peers. Did not praise the hedonistic way of life of the time. He made fun of it with Zappa's jabs at Led Zeppelin weren't just those bands. He was also angry about his own actions. Robert Plant, as well as the Zeppelin lead singer known for Golden Man and high-pitched vocals, were the symbol of the Zappa found this type of rock god of character too big for life, ready for joke in his 1971 movie and the music that went with it. Zappa talked about Plant on his album 200 Motel as Robert Planet and Robert Planted, names that showed how disrespectful he was attitude toward what the singers with their own value, while many artists of the time might not have been right to say bad things about a band as well known as when it came to Led Zeppelin and Zappa. Doubts about Zappa's dislike of Led Zeppelin wasn't based on an easy idea. I didn't like their sound. It was an example of his wider criticism of mainstream rock society. He often pushed the idea of rock bands as unbreakable heroes, and Led Zeppelin too, because of their mythical status, was a aim for on Zeppelin, which was full of magic love of the blues and raw power. Zappa was all about taking apart irony and complexity of his music, affected by everything from doo-wop to orchestral music, often worked against the simple attraction of a band like Zeppelin was interesting because of his. Even Zappa himself was used to being criticized to artistic excess. His works could be deep, self-indulgent, and technically difficult, and often pushing the limits of what rock fans thought was possible. What Zappa did, though, was he was intelligent instead of hedonistic. Wasn't interested in more just for the sake of more by show. He used it to push art, set limits, and standardize he did very well in the business. That Zappa, if they've ever played together or worked together in some way, it's not likely that the meeting would have been friendly. Zeppelin, especially guitarist Jimmy Page, stole their song and look. Seriously, while Zappa made a living by getting inside the heads of rock stars, even though both artists were great at what they did, on their own, their ideas were just too different to line up. If anything, the difference is what makes it interesting. An image of the two sides of rock. 1970s sounds on one side having fun too much and mystery on the other, taking it apart with sharp wit and complex sounds like the Eagles. Zappa's dislike for the Eagles came from many things, including their mainstream allure, that they rely on polished tunes that are good for radio, and they're sticking to a set of musical rules that he thought put mass market first choice of spending over artistic depth. The Eagles are one of the most popular bands of all the time, became a sign of soft rock and the California sound coming together, country rock and pop sounds, in a way that millions of people could relate to. While there's no doubt that their music was well made, they had strong harmonies and skillful playing of music. Zappa saw it as bland, not creative, and missing in new ideas. For Zappa's creativity and musical complexity was very important to him. Classical musicians have had a big impact on Igor Stravinsky and Edgar Vess, as well as jazz artists who made the limits of how music is put together, and making up his own music a lot, added time markers that were not normal, unusual instruments and sound effects, satirical songs that poked fun at society rules, politics, and the music business itself stood in contrast to his complex and songs that are often difficult. The Eagles' song most likely seemed simple. and safe chords that are reliable progressions and easy-to-understand words that catered to popular tastes as well. Zappa was very independent in his work. When it came to music, he often turned down the standard ways that records are put together. Industry chose to make his own albums and stay in charge of his Eagles' artistic work. On the other hand, hands were deeply rooted in the business. Music machine is doing well because big label backing, a lot of radio airplay, and a business world that how perfect their sound is to Zappa. This showed everything that was wrong what he saw with rock music in the 1970s, as a change from raw experimental moving innovation toward a standard sold in stores. The criticisms that product Zappa made of mainstream rock was more than just the Eagles. He aimed at other well-known rock bands of the time, making fun of how predictable they were. And business reasons, he saw the growth of radio-friendly bands formats and marketing for big labels, efforts to show that the business world was in charge of the art instead of the musicians are leading the way. In this setting, the Eagles were simple to beat target, which they were wildly successful and admired a lot, and their music fit neatly into the business world's trade sketch. Of that being said, Zappa's complaints were not necessarily about the person talent or precise skill as a musician, but more about what their music sounds like represented. The Eagles were without a doubt skilled at making well-produced works, rock songs with catchy melodies, and their success was an example of how well they can connect with people who like Zappa. Music wasn't just about making money, it was about pushing limits and being tough the way things are now and looking for new sounds. He saw a lot of opportunities and showed the opposite, a safe market-tested sound that was made to appeal to as many people as possible without taking chances with their art. Punk rock. One of Zappa had a lot of problems with punk rock was making it business despite its rhetoric against the system. Punk became a highly marketed style very quickly. Kind of music record labels and fashion businesses made money off of the punk scene. Looks like torn clothes and spiked hair, leather coats that make it a thing that can be sold and used by many people. This change from rebellion to another, a market trend that was at odds with Zappa. Had always believed in his own ideas. Worked mostly outside of the mainstream in the music business by starting his own labels and fiercely protecting his artistic work. He was well aware of how to use his freedom. Business groups could co-opt groups of people and turn them into. He didn't see punk rock as a good thing, a natural revolt against the way things are. It was just one more way to record. CEOs will sell songs to young, unhappy person. He saw punk's loud calling for rebellion as in terms of performance rather than substance, made for a crowd ready to believe what you're told. Not conforming to any rules was Zappa's. There was more hatred for punk in what he thought of the UK band Sex Pistols. They are often given credit for introducing punk to most people, while many saw the Sex as the personification of raw against the establishment. Zappa turned them down as a fake product of Malcolm McLaren, the boss of the band and the genius behind their picture. McLaren had a background in fashion and made the Sex Pistols on purpose as a shock value act meant to upset anger and interest at the same time. And selling music. Zappa, who was worth most important is the accuracy of the art, thought this was especially funny. He saw the band's reputation as fake, and their Johnny's singing skills aren't very good. Sid Vicious' sneering performance of Rotten famous pranks and the band's crazy one or more acts may have touched a nerve. Young people who are wild, but to Zappa all of this was a big show with no real craft or new ideas. It is important to note that Zappa was not a fan of power or following the rules himself. During his career, he fiercely attacked censorship and greed in business and government hypocrisy, but not like punk bands who told us about their anger through a lot of raw anger and nihilistic ideas. The humor that Zappa used was very sharp pieces of music and technical skill to break down social standards, which he wasn't desired to fight for its own sake. His criticisms were well thought out, with a lot of intellectual depth and music, which is funny because punk it was proud of being an outsider in a lot of ways. Zappa was the real. He was an outsider who never fit nicely into any rhythmic genre that won't cater to industry trends or what people expect from the show. He made his own way, and maybe that's why he thought punk was so. His doubts It seemed like the packaged form of what real art rebels should. What do you think of these bands? Frank Zappa's dislike of them. Leave.